The only satisfactory way to teach English literature to beginners is to put the literature itself in their hands and try to aid them in getting an intelligent appreciation of it. The study of literary evolutions is important even at first, but only insofar as it is an aid to such appreciation. It is especially desirable that the student should not think of the study of the poets, for example, as consisting chiefly in the study of what other people have written about them. Yet, it is hardly practicable to dispense with the textbook altogether. The earliest authors that have usually been read by the underclassmen in Yale College, for example, are Spenser and Shakespeare. The writers who cannot be enjoyed without some preliminary linguistic study have been reserved for a later place in the curriculum. Curriculum. But even Spenser and Shakespeare and their period can best be taken up after at least a slight knowledge of the earlier history of our literature has been acquired. This book has been written to supply what the author's experience has shown to be a real need. Its purpose is to give to those who do not, for the present at least, require an intimate acquaintance with Old and Middle English authors, such a knowledge of their characteristics and historical relations as may serve for an introduction to the study of the Elizabethan and later periods. Several other books covering much of the same ground are easily available, but they are either very elementary in treatment or so crowded with barren statements of unimportant facts as to defeat the purpose just suggested. Mere digests of names and dates may be excellent for reference or as companions to actual reading, but they cannot profitably be used alone for continuous study. The present work is designed as a sort of compromise. It is not a history of our early literature, but an introduction to the history of our later literature. It does not give an account of all our early writers, nor even of all the important ones. But it selects striking representatives of a few great facts in the history of our literature and attempts to give a sufficiently full account of them to impress the student's imagination and leave some distinct trace in his memory. A few extracts in translation are given from the older writers, and longer passages are given in the original from such works as can be made fairly intelligible with the aid of occasional glosses. In the longest selections, the line numbering of the original text is noted in the margin to facilitate either classroom reference or consultation of commentaries. The first chapter is inserted because of a grievous need within the writer's own experience. Students ought to know something of English history before they approach the history of English literature, but in fact they often do not. And in this chapter, therefore, as well as several minor passages in the later chapters, seemed indispensable. The second chapter is not necessary to the student of literary history, but it is desirable that he should not be ignorant of the facts contained in it, for literature and language do not develop in entire independence of each other. Moreover, it will doubtless be found useful in the early part of a college course to give the student some knowledge of the general nature of linguistic studies, if only that he may be intelligently guided in his choice of more advanced courses. The book is novel in plan, but it was, of course, no essential part of its plan to give new facts or new views. The author has freely availed himself of the researches of others. His chief indebtedness is to Lounsbury's and Emerson's histories for the materials of the second chapter, but a detailed acknowledgement would include Morley, Tenbrink, Skeat, Gaston Paris, Petit de Jouville, Cook, Aiken, Woolker, Trevelyan, Andrew D. White, Brooke, Nutt, Seebohm, and many others. Since the beginning of British history, Britain has been a home for several races, but all have belonged to the Indo-European family. It is known, however, that at least 3 other races occupied the island before. Our knowledge of these 3 is obtained from fossils, stone implements, burial mounds, and other similar remains. The first race seems to have been not very much more civilized than the beasts that they killed and ate. The second used stone weapons with wooden handles and were fond of scratching rude pictures on bones or other substances. They are thought to have been related to the modern Eskimo. The third were Iberians, like the modern Basques of the Pyrenees Mountains. Of these 3 races, the first 2 have probably passed away altogether from the British Islands, but it is supposed that the Iberians have left descendants by intermarriage among all Indo-European races of the West. The Iberians of Britain were able to spin and weave, till the ground, and sail the sea. They had some tribal organization and built rude fortifications. They were barbarians, but hardly savages. The first Indo-Europeans to reach Britain were of the Celtic branch of the family. They came several centuries before the Christian era and either exterminated or absorbed their predecessors. They were in Britain when the island first became known to the civilized world, and their descendants still inhabit Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and even parts of England. The early Celts, unlike the Iberians, were learning the use of iron. They lived in wattled huts of clay, sticks, and reeds. They had a well-developed tribal organization, with chieftains and aristocracy at the head. And they had a polytheistic religion vaguely similar to that of the Greeks and Romans. They had some savage customs, such as that of tattooing their bodies, and perhaps in the earliest times, polyandry. And their druids, who were at once priests, physicians, judges, and counselors, sometimes offered human sacrifices to their gods. But in general, their civilization was much higher than that of the Iberians. Celtic Britain was known commercially to southern Europe long before the time of Caesar, but Caesar's invasion is practically the beginning of the island's authentic history. Even this event was of less moment than it's sometimes supposed, for Caesar did not conquer Britain. Perhaps, indeed, he never intended to do more than terrorize the inhabitants, and so ensure the peace of Gaul. He was in Britain for less than 3 months, and he left no material evidences of his 2 expeditions. About a century later, however, Claudius invaded Britain as a conqueror, and until the year 411, the southern part of the island was a Roman possession. Rome lost nearly as much as she gained by the conquest, for Britain swallowed up legions almost as fast as it yielded spoils. But a great change was wrought in the island itself. The Romans did not slaughter those whom they could just as well pacify, and during the Roman period, therefore, southern Britain was at least outwardly civilized. Roman roads were arteries of commerce as well as of warfare. Roman villas superseded the old wattled wigwams. Roman theaters, baths, and temples, and the Latin language all became familiar to the conquered race. The blessings of civilization, however, were dearly bought. The Britons paid, as taxes on their land, 1/10 and sometimes even 1/5 of its annual produce. They paid taxes for maintenance of troops, taxes for entertainment of officials, taxes for repairing roads, taxes for carrying stocks of merchandise, and taxes upon succession to inheritances. They paid poll taxes, customs and market dues, and fees for license to do ordinary labor. And all these taxes were collected by foreign officials with little restraint, doubtless upon corruption. The fighting men of the subject Britons were deported to wage Rome's wars. Elsewhere, and in those who remained in the island, vigorous manhood and the love of freedom became nearly extinct. When the last Roman legions were withdrawn, it was not because the Britons were able to shake off the yoke, but because the empire itself was decaying and Rome needed all her strength for self-defense.